Hello. The early history of Games Workshop is one of friendships, opportunities, and unsurprisingly, games. This is the company that helped to build a new gaming culture, that introduced D&D to the UK, and that formalized the business of making, playing, and importantly selling those games. And nowhere is that more evident than in the publications that Games Workshop has released since its very beginning. I'm Jordan. This is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're reading the history of Games Workshop's first magazine, Owl and Weasel. Preserve this copy carefully. Who knows? The very piece of paper you now hold between your fingers may become a rarity, its value soaring to 1 3/4 times its present cost. Those were the words on the cover of the first ever issue of Owl and Weasel, released in 1975, at a cover price of 10p. Whilst the prediction that this could be a valuable artifact was quite right, I think they may have undersold themselves. It would definitely cost you more than 17.5p to buy one today. Edited by both Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, Owl and Weasel was the first monthly publication produced by Games Workshop, a newsletter concerned with what could loosely be described as progressive games, in which category I would include Hyboria and Midgard, computer gaming, psychological games, new ideas about abstract games, and so forth. During its 25-issue run, Owl and Weasel would chart the growth of the tabletop hobby in 1970s Britain, and with it, the beginnings of Games Workshop. And the newsletter was very keen on community participation, so why not do it a favour and leave this video a like. Games Workshop was founded in 1975, and it wouldn't be until 1977 that the first issue of the now very famous White Dwarf magazine would be published. During that 2-year gap, the founders of GW, Ian Livingstone, Steve Jackson, and John Peake, decided that they needed a way to promote their new company and talk about the games that they loved, were playing, and they were importing as well. Steve Jackson had been a regular contributor to Games and Puzzles, a magazine founded in 1972 to talk about games of every kind, from darts and dice to word games and war games. Working as a journalist for the magazine had in fact been Jackson's first paid job in the games industry, and that experience would serve him well as one of the major contributors to Owl and Weasel's early issues. Games and Puzzles magazine was selling well, and the co-founders of Games Workshop saw that appetite and thought that it was the perfect opportunity for them to capitalize on this burgeoning games market. They wanted to build a community of readers and gamers. They couldn't afford to create a magazine just yet, but they could make a fanzine. So that is exactly what they did. The first issue was released in February 1975, just 1 month after Games Workshop had been founded, and it ran to 4 pages. It was produced using 2 old typewriters and a set of Letraset typeface transfer sheets. The contents of that first issue are eclectic, as would be the first several issues. On the front page, there is a sort of review of the party game Killer, the game where the person who draws a short straw has to surreptitiously wink at other players to kill them, which, interestingly enough, is pretty similar to the party game Killer, which would be released by the American Steve Jackson just 6 years later. There is also news of some new games, a rules variant for Monopoly called Depopoly, and a rigorous discussion between Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone about the hobby of wargaming. Just the first of several hints of prescience and prediction, or just a coincidence potentially. There are also several calls for reader submissions. We have great hopes for the newsletter, all of which depend on participation. So if any of you out there would like to drop us a line or a book, we'll be able to fill a page or so with letters and comments. The newsletter also included some puzzles like a crossword, though early feedback was apparently not too favourable for that feature. In fact, in his first editorial for the newsletter, which appeared in issue 2, Steve Jackson reports that he'd already been asked by a reader to get rid of the puzzles. The reader would not have to wait too long. The logo for Owl and Weasel remains one of its most charming design features. For some reason, I just really like it. Ian Livingstone has since reflected on that first issue, describing it as particularly amateurish, and that he's surprised anybody actually bought it. Now, I don't know how many people did buy it, but we do know that plenty of people read it. And that was partly because of a very canny marketing move, and a connection with an earlier era of games industry publishing. Albion was an amateur zine about wargames that ran from 1969 to 1975. It was created and edited by Don Turnbull. Turnbull was a journalist and teacher who took an early interest in Gary Gygax's new Dungeons & Dragons game, and would go on to be an important figure in the growth of D&D in the UK. He had created Albion as a way to enable play-by-mail games of diplomacy. Diplomacy, if you're not familiar with it, is an influential strategy game which allows up to 7 players to control the major European powers in the run-up to the First World War. One of the unique aspects of the game is that it requires all players to reveal their moves simultaneously after an intensive round of negotiation, and that playstyle gave rise to a strong culture of play-by-mail games. In Turnbull's case, he'd seen how popular that had become in the US and wanted to facilitate those kinds of games in the UK as well. Albion was set up to allow players to send their moves into him as an independent referee, and then he could publish all of the moves for all of the different games people were playing every month in his new zine. As the Albion readership grew, Turnbull expanded the remit of the zine to cover more aspects of wargaming, and eventually the diplomacy games were actually moved to a separate publication called The Courier. Turnbull increasingly became occupied with other work, and Albion started to publish less frequently, until, with January 1975's issue 50, a 109-page behemoth, Turnbull cancelled the magazine. That timing was perfectly convenient for Ian Livingstone though. Having lived in the same town and by doing work like cover design for Albion, Livingstone, Jackson and Turnbull already had a good relationship. And upon the cancellation of the Albion zine, Livingstone asked Turnbull if he would be willing to share his mailing list. Turnbull had himself borrowed a mailing list from Avalon Hill when he first established Albion, and so he readily agreed. The first issue of Owl and Weasel was sent free of charge to every member of the former Albion mailing list. With issue 2, OW underwent the first of many evolutions. It doubled in size, and it started to do something it would do more of throughout its entire run: increase its focus on wargames. There was never any danger that Owl and Weasel would become like the later White Dwarf though, fully focused on miniature wargaming. In fact, it was never even any danger of becoming like the early White Dwarfs with their RPG focus either. It was just too broad in its scope. Writing on his blog, The Other Side, in 2014, RPG author Timothy Brennan reviewed the complete run of Owl and Weasel, and those reviews have been a great help in making this video, so I owe Timothy my thanks. He describes this early era of the newsletter by saying, "It is the whole DIY and Wild West feel of the zine. It's similar to what we have going on in the blogs and boards now, but there is an earnestness about it that I find appealing." The newsletter covered a wide array of then popular tabletop titles. It picked up the diplomacy baton from Turnbull's Albion, published more variant rules for Monopoly, ran features on Mahjong, Go and chess, and covered events like 1975's Salute. In issue 5, there is a report from a seemingly dismal London toy fair held at the Cunard International Hotel. One of the only points of interest was a new Airfix game called Waterloo. Waterloo is the first attempt I have seen in this country to put tabletop wargaming into a box. It is certainly an introductory level game, and I suppose it is quite convenient to buy all the bits together in a kit. But for the £5 they ask, you could build up a much more impressive set of your own. If only they knew Games Workshop's future. Issue 6 would mark several milestones for the newsletter. Not only was the crossword now a thing of the past, there had just been too many complaints, but it was also going to cost you an extra 50% to get your monthly dose of gaming news. The cover price was now 15p. But more than that, this would be the introduction of something brand new and genuinely game-changing. In issue 6, you were about to be introduced to Dungeons and Dragons. Speaking to the Metro newspaper in 2022, Ian Livingstone explained how the worlds of Games Workshop and those of D&D would intertwine thanks to those free copies of Owl and Weasel issue 1 that they'd sent out all that time ago. I think we sent out 50 copies free to everybody we could think of, and then one found its way onto the desk of Gary Gygax, who wrote to us and said, "Love your little magazine, here's a game I've just invented, what do you think?" And that was Dungeons and Dragons. The first word of D&D in Owl and Weasel's pages had actually come in a brief news article in issue 5, when Steve Jackson had mentioned that he was keen to get hold of this new game that tabletoppers had been hearing all about. Although I've not actually played the game, I watched one in progress the other week at the City University Games Club and was fascinated. More news when I've played it, unless anyone fancies writing a review. It turned out though that Steve Jackson would not need anybody to submit that review, because he was about to play Dungeons and Dragons for himself. The copy of the game that Gary Gygax had sent to Games Workshop was about to form the basis of an adventure run by Ian Livingstone, one that would dominate the next issue of the magazine. Dungeons and Dragons was mentioned briefly last issue as being a sort of free-form fantasy game. The Workshop has now had a chance to play the game, and, quite honestly, we are obsessed with it. Is it really the most original new development in progressive gaming since Diplomacy? Judge for yourself. The 3-page review reads more like a session report, telling the story of Livingstone's Caves of True-Nor adventure, which, given how new this entire genre of gaming was at the time, makes perfect sense. There was just no context yet in which to review a game like this. The term RPG didn't even seem to exist yet either. Instead, D&D is regularly described as SF/F, science fiction fantasy gaming. Suffice it to say that whilst there were some fair criticisms in the review, after all, it was more expensive to buy than Diplomacy or The Warlord, and also by its very nature the game is the most incomplete of those three, Jackson's summary makes it very clear. No doubt about it, Dungeons is a modern classic. As that obsession with D&D only increased at the gaming table and at the Games Workshop, co-founder John Peake decided in 1976 to leave the company. With the original intention for GW from his perspective being one of a company that crafted their own wooden games, something he was particularly skilled at, the increasing focus on wargames and role-playing games as they would come to be known held less of an interest for him. Throughout its run, Peake seemed less present in Owl and Weasel than Jackson and Livingstone, but even in its pages, the arc of GW towards RPGs is quite clear to see. Games Workshop may have, in a way, lost its workshop, but it was only just beginning to explore what it meant by games. The 11th issue of Owl and Weasel doubled as a programme for the first ever Games Day, a festival of gaming held by Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson at the last minute. But that is its own story. The bumper 20 pages of OW11 saw Steve Jackson considering the progression of gaming from the likes of Monopoly and Diplomacy to the current crop of sims or combat simulation games and bookcase games from Avalon Hill. Jackson's prediction was that Dungeons and Dragons was very much the future of tabletop gaming, and that gaming in general may well give television a run for its money as the most popular pastime of tomorrow. It was 1975 and sliders didn't exist yet, so we can forgive him for that one, I think. There was also a considerable amount of space given over to discussion of Empire of the Petal Throne, M.A.R. Baker's science fantasy RPG and campaign setting that was self-published in the same year as D&D and then republished the following year by TSR in 1975 as a prestige box set. The setting for Empire is the world of Tecumel, and it is in fact the first campaign setting released by TSR. Though of course it used a different rule set to their increasingly more popular D&D game, and with that popularity came a regular feature in Owl and Weasel. There would be new rules and ideas shared for D&D in every single issue going forward. With issue 12, the zine returned to its now standard 12-page size, and there was a continued coverage of board games and SFF games, but an increasing word count would be spent on D&D every issue. But there was also time for oddities as well. One of Ian Livingstone's fond memories of writing for the zine was when he put together a spoof review of a new Japanese role-playing game, Friday in Dundee. According to the review, it was possible to play a character in a modern setting doing pretty much any contemporary job. Bank clerk, lorry driver, VAT inspector, and that was it. You played the life of a regular person doing a regular job. Apparently, this confused a number of readers who thought the game was real and wanted to know if GW would actually be importing a translated version. It may sound silly on the face of it, but The Sims has since sold nearly 200 million copies, so maybe he was onto something. There was another major thread that ran through several issues of OW, one that speaks to the changes rippling through Games Workshop during this period. This was the Jack Kerouac style adventure that Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson were about to have on their US tour. The issue 16 editorial explains that Steve and Ian will be heading to the US from July to September 1976 in order to, amongst other things, visit TSR's headquarters and attend Gen Con 9. And there would be no time for new issues of Owl and Weasel whilst they were there, because they were too busy delivering cars and sightseeing. During this trip, the duo would cement their relationship with TSR and Gary Gygax, as well as meeting industry leaders from other US games companies. When they returned, they would have in hand signed deals with the most notable new games publishers from the States. And not just that, they'd picked up a fascination with baseball and, more importantly, skateboarding. Enough to devote an entire page to this emerging sport and subculture. Having met Fritz Leiber, author of Fafford and the Grey Mouser stories, at the Strategists Club dinner for Gen Con guests, it might come as no surprise to see Livingstone and Jackson give TSR's new Lankmar boxed game some extensive coverage as well. Issues 19 to 23 continued to drive down that same pathway they'd been going, and they got into a great groove with the zine. They were covering board games and war games and increasingly sci-fi fantasy games, and those D&D pages were really drawing in new readers. They were even able to increase the price of the zine to 20p per 12-issue release. But they were just about to start running out of fuel. With issue 24, the end of Owl and Weasel became apparent. Despite running for a solid 2 years and reaching a circulation of around 200 readers, the newsletter was due to come to an end with its next issue. It was going to be replaced by a more professional magazine to be called White Dwarf. TSR had recently taken a similar step with their publications, ending their OW-style zine, The Strategic Review, in favour of a brand new high-quality magazine called Dragon. And it's hard not to think that this may have influenced the thinking at Games Workshop as well. April 1977's final issue of OW would preview much of the content that would be found in the first issue of White Dwarf, such as a mock-up of the first issue cover, talk of D&D and Gaming Society news, a continued commitment to including non-sci-fi fantasy games, and of course, an appeal for new contributors. Several of the names who had worked on Owl and Weasel would be amongst those involved in White Dwarf, including Lou Pulsifer and old friend Don Turnbull, who would refine some of the D&D work he had done in OW when it came to creating his Monster Mark system and the Fiend Factory column for White Dwarf. And there was good news for OW subscribers as well, because their subscriptions would carry over to the new White Dwarf magazine. Timothy Brennan, in his overview of the complete run of Owl and Weasel, talks about how, with White Dwarf ultimately becoming exclusively driven by wargaming content, it's possible to see that as a complete change from what White Dwarf first was, an RPG magazine, really. But he goes on to mention that Owl and Weasel, at its roots, started as a wargaming magazine. It had diplomacy at its very heart. That's where the original mailing list came from. That was one of the key things that was covered, as well as all of the other games as well. But there is that kernel of wargames journalism at the very centre of Owl and Weasel, and that is where White Dwarf, the successor, would ultimately end up. And I think that's quite an interesting closed loop almost. The other thing that he mentioned was that for such a slim newsletter, so few pages overall, it is astonishing how many submissions requests there really are, how many people they ask to provide content. And I guess it's an interesting thing, because I've seen that in Warlock and early White Dwarf, and I guess it's just the very nature of the beast. At this time, Games Workshop was not a monolithic corporation. It was a very small entrepreneurial effort doing everything it could to succeed. It's easy to forget just how hand-to-mouth the operations of early Games Workshop were. Jackson and Livingstone spent a year living in the back of a van so that they could save money to buy stock. I guess the reason that reflection is so striking to me is just how much the story of Games Workshop and later Citadel miniatures is truly one born of two competing values: a sheer unadulterated passion for gaming, imagination and adventure, combined with a pure entrepreneurial spirit, shrewd business mind, and utter commitment to making that all into a business. From that very first admittedly amateurish and relatively slight issue, one that saw an opening in the market and took it even if it wasn't fully formed yet, to a far more professional, well-rounded and accessible publication 25 issues later. And even then, its editors knew that they would need to raise the bar even further to continue capturing the growth and credibility that they wanted and could see was out there waiting. It may be a curious footnote in the history of White Dwarf and Games Workshop now, but back then, Owl and Weasel was the culmination of that entrepreneurial spirit. It was the totality of everything Games Workshop was trying to do: build a business, build a community, build an industry. And Owl and Weasel directly influenced that in so many ways. It was responsible for creating the relationship between Games Workshop and then TSR. It was what allowed them to bring D&D into the UK. And more than that, it helped them to build their own presence as an important force in UK gaming, culture, and the business marketplace. And why was it called Owl and Weasel? Well, latterly, Steve Jackson has said that the reason is quite simple. In order to be a good gamer, you have to be as shrewd as an owl and as sneaky as a weasel. I hope you have enjoyed this newsletter from the early days of Games Workshop. It certainly helped me better understand the roots of what would flourish into the Games Workshop we know today. If you have ever read an issue of Owl and Weasel, if you've played a game of Killer at a party, or if you have thoughts on the paucity of puzzles and crosswords in gaming press, then why not leave a comment below? I would love to hear from you. Thank you very much for watching. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Listen, I love the name of the successor magazine, but I do think it was a missed opportunity not to call it Owl and Weasel and Dwarf and Journal and Gobbo. It rolls off the tongue.